How did Patton 1970 become one of the most explosive war films ever made? George C. Scott's powerhouse performance shocked audiences, but behind the cameras lurked secrecy, controversy, and battles Hollywood never expected. From Pentagon resistance to uncanny ways of reviving a polarizing general, this was no ordinary production. It was obsession captured on film. Now it's time to uncover 20 hidden facts you've never been told. The script Hollywood feared. This wasn't just a screenplay, it was a political grenade. For years, Hollywood avoided Patton because no studio wanted to touch a project that showed the general as both a hero and a deeply flawed man. Francis Ford Coppola's draft painted Patton as brilliant, arrogant, spiritual, and brutal, a blend that unsettled executives. They feared backlash from veterans groups and military leaders who still considered Patton a sacred figure. Some even warned the movie would stir old wounds, just as America was bleeding in Vietnam. What audiences didn't realize was that Patton only existed because one brave producer, Frank McCarthy, a former general himself, refused to let the project die. He spent almost a decade shopping the script, fighting constant rejection until 20th Century Fox finally relented. By then, Coppola's original draft had gathered dust for years, waiting for the right moment to explode. The result wasn't just a movie. It was a cinematic trial of one of history's most polarizing generals. Coppola was fired before he was famous. Francis Ford Coppola wasn't yet the powerhouse behind The Godfather. Back in the mid-1960s, he was a young, fiery writer brought in to breathe life into Patton. His draft delivered the now legendary opening monologue against a giant American flag. But Fox executives hated it. They thought his script was too intellectual, too philosophical, and too risky. Incredibly, they fired him before filming even began. Coppola packed up thinking his chance at Hollywood greatness had slipped away. But fate had other plans. When producer Frank McCarthy and director Franklin Schaffner revisited his draft, they realized Coppola had captured the essence of Patton pride. Fury, genius, and madness better than anyone else. His words became the spine of the movie, and that opening speech is now considered one of the greatest film openings in history. Ironically, being fired from Patton helped Coppola land The Godfather. Hollywood executives finally saw him as a writer who could handle complicated, larger-than-life men. The Pentagon turned its back. What fans never realized was that the U.S. Army wanted nothing to do with Patton. Unlike many Hollywood war epics that had full military support, this film was denied access to American tanks, uniforms, and even advisors. Why? Because the Pentagon hated how the movie portrayed Patton as unstable, egotistical, and dangerously unpredictable. They didn't want audiences questioning the dignity of their generals during the Vietnam era when public trust in the military was already crumbling. With no cooperation from Washington, the filmmakers turned to an unlikely source, Spain. Under Francisco Franco's dictatorship, Spain provided tanks, equipment, and thousands of soldiers to play both Allied and German armies. Ironically, the U.S. government's refusal gave the movie a more authentic grit. Instead of polished American resources, the film had the rough edges of borrowed armies and worn-down machines. The Pentagon thought they were punishing Patton. Instead, they gave it the raw realism that turned it into legend. Franco's Spain supplied the war. This wasn't just a movie shot in Spain, it was practically built by Franco's army. Because the U.S. military refused to lend support, director Franklin Schaffner struck a deal with the Spanish government. Franco's regime offered access to tanks, artillery, and soldiers, many of whom had fought in Spain's brutal civil war. For battle scenes, thousands of extras from the Spanish army were dressed as both Nazis and Americans, often switching uniforms in the same day to save costs. The tanks rolling across Europe in the movie? They weren't American Shermans or German Panzers. They were outdated Spanish vehicles painted over with symbols of war. To the casual eye, it worked. To historians, it was shocking. Viewers thought they were watching American might recreated on screen. In reality, it was Spain still under a dictatorship reanimating World War II. It gave the film its scale, but it also meant the authenticity was built on a strange, almost surreal partnership. George C. Scott refused Hollywood's crown. This wasn't just a win, it was a rebellion. George C. Scott won the Academy Award for Best Actor in Patton. But instead of basking in Hollywood glory, he rejected the honor. Scott despised the Oscars, calling them a 2-hour meat parade. He warned the Academy beforehand not to nominate him, but they ignored him. When he won, he refused to even show up. Reporters were stunned. Audiences were confused. And Hollywood was embarrassed. No actor in modern times had so publicly snubbed the industry's biggest prize. Scott believed awards cheapened art-turning performance into a popularity contest. His rejection became as famous as his portrayal of Patton. In a strange way, it fit perfectly. Just as Patton disobeyed orders and courted controversy, Scott refused to bend to Hollywood tradition. The man and the character became one, defiant, uncompromising, and unforgettable. The slapping incident was too real. This wasn't just drama, it was history brought back to life. One of the most infamous scenes in Patton shows the general slapping a soldier suffering from battle fatigue. Audiences gasped, but few realized how accurate it was. Patton had actually slapped not one but two soldiers during the Sicilian campaign, calling them cowards. The scandal nearly ended his career. Eisenhower himself had to step in, forcing Patton to publicly apologize. The filmmakers knew this was explosive material, and the Pentagon begged them to cut it. They refused. Instead, they leaned into it, presenting the slaps with unflinching honesty. For the first time, the world saw not just the glory of a general, but the darker cost of his ego. The scene still sparks debate today. Was it bravery, cruelty, or both? The opening speech was a gamble. What audiences didn't know was that the legendary opening speech almost didn't happen. Standing before a giant American flag, George C. Scott delivers Patton's fiery words about winning through blood, guts, and willpower. Studio executives panicked. They worried that starting with such a long, aggressive monologue would bore audiences. Some even suggested moving it later or cutting it entirely. But director Franklin Schaffner held firm. He believed that if Scott could command the screen for 6 uninterrupted minutes, audiences would be hooked for the rest of the film. He was right. The gamble paid off, and that opening became one of the most iconic beginnings in cinema history. So iconic that soldiers later quoted it in real life, as if Patton himself had spoken those words on film, shot in a single take. This wasn't a stitched-together performance, it was lightning caught once. George C. Scott insisted the opening speech be filmed in one uninterrupted take. No safety net, no second guessing. He believed chopping it up into multiple camera angles would weaken the raw energy. The crew set up rolled cameras and Scott delivered. The gravel in his voice, the command in his body language, the fury in his eyes, it was all captured in one go. Schaffner added only a few edits to adjust pacing, but what audiences see is essentially the same thunderous performance Scott gave live. The power of that choice cannot be overstated. It set the tone for the entire film and established Scott not just as an actor, but as Patton reincarnated on screen. Scott nearly walked off set. This wasn't just method acting, it was conflict boiling over. George C. Scott hated the false teeth prosthetics and makeup designed to make him look more like the real Patton. He thought they were unnecessary, even insulting. At one point, he threatened to quit unless they toned down the alterations. Schaffner knew he couldn't afford to lose his star, so he struck a compromise. Minimal prosthetics, but enough costuming detail to capture Patton's essence. The result was a fusion of actor and character that felt authentic without being a caricature. In hindsight, it's hard to imagine anyone else in the role. Scott's resistance didn't weaken the movie, it preserved its balance. Audiences weren't watching an imitation of Patton. They were watching the spirit of the man unfiltered through Scott's own face. The Germans were Spanish soldiers in disguise. What audiences never realized was that the German forces weren't German at all. With no U.S. Army cooperation, the filmmakers turned to Franco's Spain for manpower. Thousands of Spanish soldiers were dressed in Nazi uniforms, marching across recreated battlefields in place of the Wehrmacht. Many of these men had fought in Spain's own civil war just decades earlier, making the illusion even stranger. To save money, extras sometimes played Americans in the morning and Germans in the afternoon, swapping uniforms depending on what the script demanded. The tanks rumbling through the scenes weren't German Panzers or American Shermans, but outdated Spanish machines painted to resemble them. It was cinematic sleight of hand on a massive scale, and it worked. Viewers believed they were watching the armies of World War II clash, when in reality it was Spain's dictatorship playing dress-up. That bizarre arrangement gave the film its epic scale, but it also meant that one of Hollywood's most American war movies was built on the backbone of a foreign regime. Scott injured himself on camera. This wasn't just method acting, it was a painful sacrifice. During one intense scene, George C. Scott threw himself into a fall with reckless abandon, determined to capture Patton's physicality without relying on stunt doubles. The impact jarred his back badly, leaving him injured for weeks. Director Franklin Schaffner offered to redo the scene with safer choreography, but Scott refused. He insisted the take be kept in the film, arguing that its rawness was exactly what made Patton feel alive. What audiences saw wasn't a trick of editing, but Scott's body slamming the ground with brutal authenticity. The choice blurred the line between performance and reality, and it fit the spirit of both actor and character. Just as Patton himself charged into danger without hesitation, Scott demanded the same of his performance. The result was a scene that radiates intensity, not polished, not staged, but lived. It was a small injury that left a lasting impression, showing how far Scott would go to embody the general's uncompromising willpower. Nixon watched it obsessively. What few knew at the time was that Patton became required viewing inside the White House. President Richard Nixon reportedly screened the film multiple times, often before key speeches about Vietnam. To him, Patton's fiery rhetoric and defiant spirit mirrored his own struggles as commander-in-chief. Aides worried Nixon was too inspired by the general's uncompromising attitude, particularly his insistence that America must never be seen as weak. Critics later suggested that the movie fed Nixon's already combative worldview. But whatever the interpretation, the fact is undeniable. Patton wasn't just a war film. It became a political text shaping the mindset of one of America's most controversial leaders. For Nixon, George C. Scott's growling declaration that Americans love a winner wasn't just dialogue, it was doctrine. The film's legacy wasn't confined to theaters. It reached the highest office in the land and, in its own way, influenced the direction of U.S. policy. That eerie overlap between art and power remains one of the movie's strangest consequences. The film was almost 4 hours long. Few realize that the version of Patton we know today is trimmed from a much larger beast. Franklin Schaffner's first cut stretched close to 4 hours, a sprawling epic heavy with battlefield detail and long stretches of character study. Early test audiences were overwhelmed. The film was powerful, but patience wore thin. Fox executives demanded a ruthless edit, and nearly 40 minutes were stripped away. Some of that lost material survives in archives, but most of it has never been seen. What did those missing scenes contain? Reports suggest deeper looks at Patton's personal quirks, extended military councils, and even more battlefield grit. Ironically, the cuts may have saved the film. By tightening the story, Schaffner ensured George C. Scott's towering performance stayed front and center. Instead of exhausting audiences, the leaner version delivered momentum and punch. Still, the thought lingers. Would a director's cut change how we view Patton today? Perhaps. But the final version proved that sometimes less really is more. Jerry Goldsmith's haunting score. This wasn't just background music, it was the voice of destiny itself. Composer Jerry Goldsmith crafted one of cinema's most unusual war scores, using a haunting 3-note motif echoed with reverb to create a ghostly effect. That echo wasn't just style. It symbolized Patton's belief in reincarnation, the idea that he had fought as a warrior across centuries. Traditional war movies relied on bold, triumphant marches, but Goldsmith went in the opposite direction. His music unsettled even as it inspired. The echoes felt like bugle calls from another life, drifting through time to haunt the general's present. Critics hailed it as revolutionary. The score didn't simply underscore battles, it got inside Patton's mind, whispering of fate and obsession. Goldsmith's daring approach earned him an Academy Award nomination and elevated the film into psychological territory most war epics never touch. Even today, those eerie notes give Patton a spectral quality, reminding viewers that this was not just the story of a general, but of a man haunted by ghosts he swore were real. Real generals objected loudly. The backlash from military circles was swift and sharp. Retired generals lined up to denounce Patton, accusing it of tarnishing a hero's name. They argued the film exaggerated his temper, his arrogance, and his mysticism, while downplaying his tactical genius. Some even warned that younger audiences would come away thinking Patton was more tyrant than leader. Yet the controversy only fueled the film's cultural power. By refusing to smooth Patton into a flawless myth, the filmmakers forced America to confront uncomfortable questions. Can greatness exist without ego? Can victory excuse cruelty? The generals may have wanted a cleaner version of history, but audiences embrace the messier truth. The debates sparked in 1970 still echo today, proof that the film hit a nerve deeper than its critics expected. For Hollywood, that criticism was gold. Every protest reminded the public that this was not a safe biopic. It was a grenade lobbed at the myths of war. Scott became Patton off camera. George C. Scott didn't just play Patton, he became him. Cast and crew recalled how he carried the general's swagger, even when the cameras weren't rolling. He barked orders at extras, strode around set with commanding presence, and slipped so deeply into character that people began treating him like a real commander. At first it seemed like a joke, but soon the effect was uncanny. Scott blurred the boundary between role and reality, and that intensity radiated into the finished film. His co-star, Karl Malden, later remarked that working with Scott was like working with Patton himself, intimidating, unpredictable, and oddly magnetic. Method acting was nothing new by 1970, but Scott took it further. He wasn't just researching a character, he was channeling one. The result was a performance so raw that even skeptics believed they were watching reincarnation, not impersonation. It left cast and crew rattled, but audiences electrified. Scott hadn't just acted, he had conjured. The Academy was furious at Scott. Hollywood had banked on George C. Scott's Oscar win to crown Patton as a triumph. Instead, Scott embarrassed the industry. His public refusal of the Best Actor award shocked audiences and humiliated the Academy live on its biggest night. Behind closed doors, members fumed. Some wanted him barred from future nominations, accusing him of disrespecting the institution. Others quietly admitted his defiance was a strike of genius. Either way, the damage was done. For decades, the Oscars had been treated as untouchable royalty. Scott shattered that illusion in one night. He exposed the ceremony as politics and popularity, not pure art. The Academy eventually moved on, but the wound lingered. Scott's rebellion paved the way for later actors to question the system, to treat the gold statue as optional rather than sacred. In rejecting the crown, he made himself king in another way, a maverick no Hollywood machine could control. The slapping scene sparked PTSD debates. When Patton showed the general slapping a soldier suffering battle fatigue, it did more than dramatize history. It reignited a national conversation. Vietnam was raging, and thousands of young Americans were struggling with the psychological toll of combat. Many veterans watched the scene with fury, feeling it mocked their suffering. Others defended it as an honest portrait of wartime pressure. Newspapers debated it. Psychologists weighed in. Suddenly, a moment from 1943 became a flashpoint for 1970. In a sense, the film forced America to reckon with something it had long ignored: the invisible wounds of war. Though the term PTSD wouldn't be formalized for years, Patton dragged the subject into the light. The controversy proved that movies aren't just entertainment, they can become battlegrounds of their own. For all its tanks and explosions, it was that single slap that hit hardest because it carried the weight of real pain still echoing in the present. The final scene was symbolic. The film doesn't end with victory trumpets, it ends with silence and reflection. Patton walks his dog down a lonely path, narrating how ancient Roman generals once celebrated triumphs only to be reminded by servants that all glory is fleeting. The imagery was deliberate. Schaffner wanted audiences to leave not in triumph, but in contemplation. It wasn't just the story of one general, it was America's story too, a reminder that every empire, every war, every leader eventually fades. By closing on melancholy instead of glory, the film stood apart from other war epics. It refused to flatter. Instead, it whispered a warning about pride, power, and the fragility of fame. For audiences in 1970, with Vietnam dividing the nation, the message landed with haunting weight. Even now, that closing walk lingers in memory. It's not an ending. It's a reminder that victory is never permanent, and legends don't escape mortality. Patton's family had mixed feelings. When the film premiered, the Patton family's reactions were as divided as the critics. Some relatives praised George C. Scott's performance as uncannily true to life. Others despised the portrayal, claiming it emphasized his flaws, his temper, his arrogance at the expense of his brilliance as a strategist. Letters poured into 20th Century Fox, both congratulating and condemning the film. That divide mirrored the world's reaction. Half saw a flawed genius, half saw a dangerous egomaniac. But in truth, that split is exactly what made the film powerful. It captured Patton's contradictions without offering easy answers. Was he a hero? A cautionary tale? Both? Even within his own family, the legend couldn't be pinned down. The fact that Patton stirred such passion at home only proved that the film had tapped into something authentic. It wasn't a monument. It was a mirror reflecting the glory and the scars of a man who could never be simplified. Patton wasn't just a war movie, it was a blast of controversy that shook Hollywood and even echoed in Washington. From George C. Scott's defiance to the Pentagon's resistance, every frame carried secrets audiences never imagined. And now that you know the truth, was Patton a tribute to genius or a warning about power? Share your thoughts below, hit like and subscribe, and keep watching for more untold Hollywood stories waiting to be uncovered.